My name is Rohadi. Welcome, friends, to the Faith in a Fresh Vibe podcast. This is a serial season entitled Farewell Evangelicalism, episode 2 in season 11. Recording on Treaty 7 territory in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. In this episode, we set the scenes. We start peeling back the layers to make sense of how evangelicalism has wound up in the broken and malformed place it is today. It's going to take 2 episodes, episode 2 and 3. Now, it hasn't always been this way, so we should ask, when did the wheels fall off? It wasn't in 2016, 2020, it wasn't the pandemic, it wasn't 2024, it wasn't COVID, it wasn't Obama. Rather, evangelicals and conservative Christianity in general were radicalized well before. We're going to talk about that. Working our way backwards, but keeping in mind the shift didn't happen overnight. It's likely that evangelical traditions have always been infected. This revelation that many values in evangelicalism have always existed can be shocking. But those values of rugged individualism, white supremacy, patriarchy, they're values that now supersede spiritual or biblical beliefs. Sometimes they're actually one and the same. To get to a place of learning about how evangelicals wound up in the white nationalist space they occupy today, we need to start capturing cultural context, garnering enough information to start naming the specific components that are not rooted in Scripture, that are self-serving, and that produce harm for those outside of the church community, and most definitely for those stuck within it. So one realization to name right off the bat is that we're painting with broad strokes here. Yes, it's true that not every evangelical church acts in a particular fashion. However, churches with any formative connection points to the evangelical movement automatically inherit the infected attributes, ranging from theology to organization to beliefs. It's like gluing 2 pieces of paper together. You can glue 2 whole sheets together and then try to pull them apart, or you can glue just a small little section and piece them together. But regardless, when you pull those 2 sheets apart, there's going to be damage. It's inescapable. The hope for this episode is to start giving name to cultural moments where the evil and broken pieces of evangelicalism started to come out in the open for all to see. And if more folks start making those connections that their church or belief systems once held dear carries significant baggage, and perhaps more importantly, at least through the lens of Christianity, no longer match the teachings and commandments of Jesus, that more folks inside will leave. Today, it's easy to draw the connection points between white nationalism, white supremacy, and the current versions of white evangelical, or just say evangelicalism in general. Just look at what's being preached in the churches, what's being shared on social media, what values are claimed to be core for adherents. Because there are a lot of self-identified evangelical Christians out there who revel in the fact that their faith brings harm to the least among us. Marginalized groups, including trans and queer folks, racialized minorities, women, immigrants, those with irregular status, who are of course black and brown. If you haven't noticed this trend, then you're not paying attention to social media, which I guess I envy you. Perhaps you should keep it that way. But if you're within the evangelical tradition or you're adjacent and it touches you, may I invite you to be curious, to figure out when the wheels came flying off. Because knowing your history will help make a final decision to not only leave evangelicalism or conservative Christianity for good, but it also gives helpful clues of how not to replace the thing you're leaving with the same thing that's equally morbid, empty, and hazardous to community. To help me set the stage in episode 2, I've asked 2 friends to come through and share their stories and perspectives as folks who have engaged evangelicalism at its very heart within the education system, the universities and colleges, This episode will start building a picture of that cultural context that bred the current state of evangelicalism that's careening off the rails. Then, episode 3 will continue the journey to make sense of how to untangle the how this calamity occurred. Let's begin.
Hi, I'm Scott Okamoto. I'm a writer and a podcaster and a musician, and I live in Pasadena, California on Tongva land, and I'm really happy to be here.
I mean, you were in the heart of evangelicalism and then college campus ministry too. Is that right?
InterVarsity Christian Fellowship.
Yeah. Do they have stickers for that? Probably badges like Boy Scouts.
That'd
be sweet.
I didn't get any badges.
Yeah, they're out there.
Should ask.
You just didn't get them.
I got the ads to donate to them.
Oh, you're on the list.
I was. I got off of it a long time ago because I had friends that went on to be on staff. We were helping support them while I was still a Christian. And then, I told someone the other day, I'm like the Forrest Gump of evangelical culture in the bad sense. Like I grew up like on the same block as the James Dobson's family, and he was friends with my parents. And he would come to. We babysat his son Ryan when he was out of town sometimes. The creator of the New Apostolic Reformation, that crazy dominionist stuff that came out of Fuller. That guy used to teach Sunday school class in my parents' Sunday school. They had all his books. All these like crazy pastors that are today, they're all from Pasadena. It seems like they're all from right here where I live. And
Dang, you're literally in the heart of Spankville.
Yeah,
you were a English professor at. I'll use EVU. Right?
Okay, we can say it if you want.
I know you didn't use it in the book, so
I use it in the podcast all the time. So, yeah.
Okay, so it's
one mouse click away from finding out if you read my book that I taught at Aszuza Pacific. I knew that they hated my podcast. They had board meetings about, but they also knew that if they tried to say anything, it would just make the podcast not more popular. So they were kind of in a bind. And so just to throw them an olive branch, I didn't name them in the book.
Hopefully that saved you some paperwork too.
Possibly. Although there was a part of me that was hoping I would get sued because, again, publicity, that's...
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Suddenly, I would be on Terry Gross, not Brad Onishi. I would... but no, they just kept quiet and just grumbled. Cursed
amongst
my
themselves.
Name.
Yeah. So would it be accurate that as an English professor, as you walked into this job, you were bought in to whatever Christian universities sell?
Yeah.
That day one we're going to make it.
75% bought in.
Okay. And the other 25% was just what? The weird whiteness.
Yeah. And even the conservative politics I wasn't down with by then. I was this is right before things swung real hard to the right, during the Bush years. So I wasn't down with the conservative politics, and I wasn't down with, the white nationalists. We didn't have that term, but sort of this white centeredness of it all, because I had sort of begun my awakening as an Asian American. Yeah. And knew that every room I walked into, A, they assumed I was a math professor because I'm Asian. If they noticed me at all, B.
Science second, right? So it's like,
yeah.
Not math, biology. Chemistry?
Science,
physics.
Computers.
Computers.
Yeah, it blew their mind that I was an English professor. But as far as like doctrine, salvation, we had to sign a faith statement, Jesus, salvation. They had a line in there about biblical errancy, and I didn't know that much yet, but I had just started reading a Bart Ehrman book And
Yeah,
so
yeah,
I wasn't
that's
even down
literally
with.
the opposite. Yeah.
Yeah, I was like, I don't know, but I asked some colleagues. I'm like, do you sign this? They're like, yeah, just sign it. Like, no, half the faculty doesn't believe in the inerrancy of the Bible, but
Yeah.
we're just getting paid. It's a job.
It's just a job.
Yeah.
So you're 75% bought into this university that looks like, I'll have to think of a movie that's the Stepford Wives. Is that a movie?
Stepford Wives, yeah. Our
The
own
Stepford Wives.
our own
Okay.
provost would make fun of the school, and he said it looks like when I got there, it was about 90+% white in the undergraduate population. Mind you,
Sounds
this
like my
is
high school.
Southern California in the late 90s. It does the demographics do not match that of the communities in Los Angeles at the time, so I was shook. Even though I grew up in an all white space in a mostly
Yeah.
white church, I had been to college, I'd been to grad school, I'd been out in the world, and I come back and wow, there's a lot of white people. It's like I would see a black student and just want to go and like hug them because it's like the Asian students wanted nothing to do with me. I was a little too out there, but yeah, it was a kind of situation where literally if I'm walking down out in the walk and you see another non-white student, your eyes meet and you kind of nod like, I see you. And I know what you're going through.
Yeah. Why are we here?
Yeah.
That look. So even if you started at 75% and that quickly started to wane, and you always held this outsider's perspective, largely because you were pressed there, but also because you would never find belonging in your own skin in an environment like that.
Right. Exactly.
And as an outsider looking in, you have a good sense, or you will be able to capture a sense of both seeing but also absorbing culture shifts.
Yeah.
And you were there for 15 years.
Yeah.
Within the student body, within the faculty, you can almost track, and you do so in your book somewhat, the ethos and how it shifted over time. Can you give us a snapshot, take us on a ride, maybe a journey, on a journey.
Yeah.
Culturally, how that school shifted students from when you started to when you finally left and kind of the trajectory it was going when you left.
Yeah, for sure. And that outsider status or point of view, I was good at it because that was my whole childhood, essentially.
Yeah.
Learning.
Experts.
Yeah. And I think I wouldn't call it an advantage, but the silver lining of being the outsider is developing a keen sense of observation. So if I'm going to be here at the edge of the room, I'm going to observe and see how everything works and see the different hierarchies that develop and see the conflicts. And because I'm trying to figure out a way in as a kid. So by the time I get to APU, I use that skill to just learn how to dismantle things.
Okay.
I know how this sausage is made here, and I'm going to throw a wrench into it. And all those things in a positive sense. As a Christian, barely hanging on, I thought that's the image of the kingdom of God, right? That's the image of quote unquote heaven, where everyone is equal, everyone is worshiping, everyone is together and understands each other. And so that is what was my motivation. It wasn't just to burn it all down. It was to dismantle the things that prevent the kingdom of God from finding fruition here on earth. So that was my mission initially. It later became burn it all down. I got there in the late 90s. And my first day on campus to have an interview, I park my car and I walk down the main walk. And it's like I didn't see a single person of color that day. And this big group of white students, women, are walking toward me, and they all said hi to me, like they knew me. And I'm kind of weirded out by, I went to a big public school. You don't just say hi to random people you don't know.
Yeah.
And I'm like, they're looking at me.
Small town on you.
Yeah. And then I was like, hey, where's the administration building? And they're like, oh, it's right around the corner. So I go and do the interview and I get hired and I'm walking out and I'm like, wow, everyone is so nice.
Yeah, this is going to be great.
Yeah. This is, I'm one of you now. Like, hey,
Yeah.
so I'm saying hi to people. It felt weird. It felt so
Where did
weird,
this
but
sweatshirt come from that I'm wearing?
yeah.
Jeepers.
So the vibe was this friendly Christian evangelical wholesome place.
Wholesome. Love it.
Yeah. So Bush gets elected in that weird election
Even
of
better.
2000. So a couple years in. And then there's the rise of like Rush Limbaugh had been around, but I noticed my students were coming in with less of that innocent, wholesome, aw shucks, hi,
Yeah.
blessings on your day
Blessings.
vibe to
Yeah.
being a lot more like jaded and suspicious of difference. And I didn't put it in the book, but one day this woman walks into class and she's like, I just saw a whole bunch of Mexicans like in this room, and I don't know if they should be like gathering like that. And I was just like, you're upset that you saw like more than one Mexican person gathering? That's the problem. And like, oh, you know what I mean? And I'm like, no, like what, they can't
Yeah.
just exist
Explain it
here.
for
Like,
me.
yeah. And it was that shift in like suddenly people who weren't
Mm.
clearly like centralized in the culture were seen as suspicious. Um, and so that was my job to help
Hmm.
unpack that. Like, what? Why are you? Why people are just standing there talking, and why does that bother you? So yeah, slowly as the Bush years went on, and then the culmination, I think, the really that finished it off was the 2004 election when he won re-election. Um, it was like the movement was like galvanized by that moment, and suddenly people were like, "Ah!" 2000, I didn't see after the election of 2000, there were no students cheering, or there were no signs or big meetings. But in 2004, people were running with banners up and down the main
Hmm.
walk. God won. You know, it was suddenly like,
Oh.
oh no, we're now they're like conflating Republican politics with faith. You know, like
Yeah. Yeah.
so it was a clear now union. Before it was like an understood union,
Yeah. Yeah.
but they would still talk about Jesus is most important. But now it kind of leveled up to where republicanism and Jesus are now closer
Yeah.
in
Yeah. They're
importance.
holding hands now.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So and then of course in 2008 when Obama's elected, it just all fell to pieces. That was one of my favorite days in 15 years was the day after the 2008 election and just seeing white kids crying, you know, clutching their Bibles, praying, like literally on their knees on the
Yeah.
main walk, praying
Yeah.
groups against the Antichrists, Obama, and the rest, most of us
Do you think
BIPOC folks are
Obama was the
walking around like
catalyst
winking at each other, like,
that enabled white evangelicals to say the quiet part loud?
yeah,
Yeah.
he was one of them. There's probably a few things, but yeah, that was a big one because we didn't realize it at the time. That election shook them to the core. It scared the crap out of them to the point where they could look at someone like Donald Trump and think, yeah, that guy's awesome. That guy's amazing. He's so smart and blah, blah, blah. It's like,
Well, you named it the rise of the Tea Party
yeah.
and just the start of that fringe, and it starts to someone lit the fuse, and then it starts to gain steam and gain energy.
Yeah, weirdly,
And
the Tea Party started up still during the Bush years. There were like
yeah,
Christians who were realizing that maybe Bush isn't that Christian, and he wasn't anti-immigrant enough for them because Bush was, by all accounts, a terrible president in so many ways. But the dude had a heart for immigrants. Living in Texas and having a Christian faith gave him like sympathy. Like he had speeches where he'd say, these people just want a better life, and it's here, and we have to figure out what to do with that. And that just pissed off. The Tea Party was partly formed because of their dissatisfaction with Bush. He wasn't hateful and angry enough for them, and then Obama's election just pushed them over the edge. You notice after Obama, there's no more Tea Party. it's it's just
mm-hmm,
the Republican Party now. This is no
mm-hmm.
longer a fringe element of people dissatisfied conservatives. It just crosses over and becomes the Republican Party.
Okay, Obama into Trump now. That's for 8
Yeah.
years. 8 years. That's 8 years of terror if you're a white
Yeah.
evangelical in Southern California.
It's white evangelical in all of America, really.
In all of America.
Make America Great Again was no, I don't think Trump is all that bright personally, but
Yeah.
whoever came up with Make America Great Again is the most cynical and kind of brilliant genius person, because it
Evil
tapped in.
genius. Yeah.
Yeah, it tapped into that desire to go back in time before all this progress, before all these people got their rights and in upward mobility. They always point to the 50s, which were a terrible time for most people who weren't white and not straight. And it wasn't even that great for white people, let's be honest. I mean, other than economically, you could have a blue collar job and have a house and a boat and vacation. But we're finding all kinds of things about spousal abuse, domestic violence, alcoholism. There's a dark underbelly to the 50s, but in their mind, making America great again was going back to this time when people, we didn't have the Civil Rights Act of 64. We didn't have Brown versus the Board of Education of 55. We didn't, it was like innocence, family oriented, and white people are everything is really what they meant. And in Trump years, that became okay to say. They're just saying it, During Obama, the Pew Research poll showed that evangelicals valued integrity and morality in their president most of all. And then with Trump, it's completely reversed. It doesn't matter. God uses imperfect people, and so
they flipped.
Yeah, and not only did they flip that, but they literally abandoned the gospel, like the core components of Christianity, of loving your enemies and caring for the sick and the poor and welcoming the traveler. All these core things in the Bible suddenly, we have to mess people up who we don't like. And Trump's doing that, and he's doing it to the people we don't like. And so that's Christianity now. That's evangelical Christianity. And now you're seeing megachurch pastors who are complaining that their own flock are saying they don't like Jesus anymore. He's too weak. Which
he's not white Jesus, that's for sure.
Yeah. That kind of raises some red flags in church, because when I was growing up, man, Jesus was everything in the salvation message and the gospel. Yeah. And that is not that important anymore, or they're just redefining it into Trumpian terms.
I think, there it is.
Because we thought the bottom was Bush.
Yeah.
We thought it can't get any worse than that. So and then we had Obama, and there was all this hope, and I'm not saying he was perfect. There's plenty of reasons to be critical of Obama. Sure. But it felt like progress. It felt like things are moving in the right direction. If we go from Bush to Obama, the chart the course that's charted now looks really great. And then Trump comes and just upends everything. And now, so I don't know. I will no longer try to claim that I know where the bottom is.
I mean,
so no, not a lot of hope. So I don't know if I have hope, especially for I don't have any hope for evangelical culture. I think it's a dead man walking. I think it's on life support, and we have to figure out if we're going to pull the plug.
Yeah, I appreciate that. As you were sharing, rather than state the hope, it was to state we haven't even hit bottom yet.
We might have, but just I don't know anymore. It felt like bottom in 2007, 8. Economy was crashing. All the Republicans even hated Bush. His approval rating was super low. And then Obama comes, and it's rough, but things gradually start to get a little bit better. And
there's a rallying point. But then as you said, the story was rewritten. And for evangelicals, I wonder, as I look at mainline denominations here, for example, they don't have the same enmeshment with politics. We don't have that. But we have seen the largest denominations lose 90% of their members.
Oof. Yeah.
And that's perhaps indicative of white evangelicalism, save for the time it takes. So you pull the plug, but that dude's still living.
Yeah, they'll just rebrand and regroup and do something else.
There's enough of them. There's still tens and millions of them to keep on rolling, spiraling towards the bottom. And it's getting worse as you're scraping the barrel. And it's getting worse and worse as you're spiraling further and further. But I don't see that. I see the nexus of power shifting slowly, even though the minority is still holding. There's still the power holders. So that's another problem. But in terms of faith, like, how do you even you don't. That thing's got to die. You can't redeem out of where it's at now.
That version has to die, because I think there are very good people who are Christian who are kind of sitting this one out right now and just watching what's happening and just wondering why is this happening? Probably not realizing their own role in being complicit in it happening.
Now, we can talk about Obama and those years, but that's only 12, 16 years ago. We need to go further back to see how the tentacles of conservative Christianity have been operating behind the scenes and informing folks to believe and to vote in particular ways. All of the calamity and the fear that has been bred up into the present, that has been in design and in the works for generations. We start to tease this out with my next guest.
Dr. Marlena Graves. I'm the assistant professor of spiritual formation at Northeastern Seminary. I would not be one of those that say in 2016 or 2020, I don't know if it's because I'm older than some of the guests or because, I'm biracial. I've noticed these things that people are starting to realize like a long time ago. I've seen, I didn't grow up in white evangelical culture. Part of that's like my backgrounds. I grew up speaking Spanish in my household. However, when I did return for a little bit to the campus where my husband and I graduated from, because they had asked him to work there, they said they were changing to become more broad and than they were, and we believed them until they were taken over by the Southern Baptists. They were doing that, but my husband was hired under those auspices as a philosophy professor, and then I was a resident director for students for 5 years. That's when I started, and this was 2007 and 2008, when Obama was running for president. I had seen stuff before that, but being on a white conservative evangelical campus really blew my mind as a staff person and my husband as a professor, because when Barack Obama won the election, people acted like it was the end of the world. I remember someone told me he was the Antichrist. I was like, what? Barack Obama's the Antichrist. I mean, these different tropes about Barack Obama. I was like, this is so, I can only think this is coming from racial prejudice because it's so absurd. At the time, it was John McCain and Sarah Palin running for the vice president. And I got into a conversation with this lady. She said, I don't know if I can vote for John McCain, because if he gets sick or he dies, then Sarah Palin would become president of the United States, and she would be the most in the highest position over men.
Right. Yeah.
So there's those kind of notions of manhood and gender roles. I'm like, well, do you think that women can be high school principals? Can they own a business, where they're in charge of other men? I'm like, so why can't they be the president of the United States? So it was interesting to me, not having been and grown up in that culture, only being, exposed to it for a little bit and then going back again for a little bit. I just could not believe the ridiculousness that was being espoused. But now I know more, how we know more as social media burgeoned, how much, just the news you watch and the silos you get in, you just hear certain stuff. And I guess I was not in those spaces hearing those things. So I'm like, this to me, that was coming out of left field. So all to say, I want to say that I saw it happening in real time in like 2008. But as in my PhD studies, I can trace this back way, way further back. So for many people, it's, I guess, around, I don't want to say my age, but let's say in their 20s, 30s, 40s, you know, they're just waking up to this because they've been in evangelical culture. But many people of color, especially in the United States, African Americans, for many, it was an awakening, but you can find in my own writing and the writing of other people on the internet when we were calling this out, you know, a while ago, or I don't want to say calling it out, but bringing it up, you know, bringing it up and saying, hey, this is an issue. And I've never gotten more hatred than when I bring up race or gun control.
After giving some more recent context of evangelical thought, I asked Marlena to go back into time and give us historical examples, monuments, moments in history that are integral to evangelical identity. You would be surprised of how intentional white evangelical thought has been shaped and formed around specific isms, most notably white supremacy or racism.
I have researched for my PhD program since 1750. I'm not going to start since 1750 because, like you said, that would be too long. Way back. But I'll start in the United States because you could tell me more about Canada. I cannot. My PhD is in American culture. But in 1958, George Wallace, who eventually became Alabama governor, was running for a position in Alabama. He was endorsed by the NAACP, you know, was a political moderate, a Democrat. He said, I would do a lot of talking about roads and bridges and infrastructure, and nobody listened to me. And he lost his election, his first election. I can't remember if it was for governor or something else. Mm-hmm. He's like, but then he's like, no one's going to out-end me ever again. And so he completely repudiated his relationship with the NAACP and became known as a very, very blunt white supremacist in the South. However, a few years later, he was in New York City at Madison Square Garden. And at that time, say 1959, 1960, he had the most people show up at Madison Square Garden that had ever shown up at that time to hear him speak as a white supremacist. And there was a journalist that said George Wallace, this guy from Alabama, had an epiphany. And the epiphany went something like, by God, they're all racist. The whole United States is Southern. Because he said it wasn't just people from the South coming to see him in Madison Square Garden. It was people all over. Anytime he upped the racial rhetoric and dog whistles, he got a lot of attention. And then he eventually was going to run for president, and Richard Nixon who won the presidency, had a backdoor conversation with him. It's like, you know, if you, and Strom Thurmond, another person, if you guys kind of back out and support me, I won't keep writing the civil rights wrongs in the South. We'll kind of hush everything down after 1964 and 1965. Basically, I'll give you what you white supremacists want if you come and join the Republican Party. And he told George Wallace, and George Wallace was a Democrat, so was Strom Thurmond. What was exactly said, we don't know. But George Wallace backed out, and Richard Nixon won the election. And Strom Thurmond, who was what was called a Dixiecrat, a Southern Democrat, racist, became a Republican. And all the Southern racist Democrats entered the Republican Party because they liked what Richard Nixon was doing, which was promoting white supremacy in politics to win. And then, so that was in 1958, the 60s. And then Richard Nixon's, I can't remember his first name, but his last name is Phillips. He wrote the handbook for using, in my words, white supremacy to win presidential elections in the United States. And it's like, he said, you got to find out who hates whom. You have to fuel racial hatred. And, you know, basically it's called the Southern strategy, using politically, and I'm coming from a political context, this is how we win presidential elections in the United States. And even Bill Clinton, who was a Democrat, used that in 1996 when he was trying to appease the Republicans. And if someone's listening to this, I don't hate Republican people. I'm just telling you, this is how strategy, it is.
Yep.
Yeah, this is how it flipped. And I don't know if you're familiar with, but there was another guy. He talked about how in 1980s, when Reagan was running, he talked to pastors in Dallas, Texas, saying he does not want everyone to vote, because when everyone votes in the United States, that means, AKA also known as people of color, then their Republican family values platform, the chance of it winning goes down. And he said, not everyone has ever voted in the United States. And he was right, because, the vote used to be for white men who own property. And when people of color start voting, it's bad for the Republicans and family values platform that are now entangled.
Yeah.
And so he said that outright. There's a video recording of it, information about what happened at that event in 1980. And that's when Ronald Reagan said, this is in the 80s now, that you can't endorse me officially as a candidate to the evangelical pastors. At that same conference where this guy said they didn't want everyone to vote, Ronald Reagan said, you can't endorse me. You can't endorse a political candidate, but I can endorse you. And that's in 1980 when the religious right and the Republican Party united. And ever since then, they have used the Southern strategy, that is using white supremacy and dog whistles to irritate the electorate to gain votes. And Lindsey Graham, who's a Southern senator from South Carolina, even in 2012, when Barack Obama won, said, we have not made enough white men angry to win that 2012 election against Barack Obama. We're not making enough white men angry. And he, in that moment, I think it's in the Associated Press or Reuters, he's saying that he said that out loud. That was 2012. Right. Since then, and because my studies I've just been paying attention, even where I used to live in Ohio, they were very, in 2020, 2021, 2022, a Republican, a federal judge, a Republican in Ohio said, your district maps in Ohio are so racist that you have to go back and redraw them. This was a Republican judge, not a Democrat judge. So it's real bad when a Republican elected judge said, the lines you draw for the district.
So bad.
Yeah, you gerrymandered it so bad. As a Republican, it's so racist and it's so obvious. So people don't like to believe that race is used in politics, but the proof is undeniable. It's undeniable. And the church, the white, let's just say white evangelical church, often mirrors the culture in those areas. I was hoping to find information about the white evangelical pastors or leaders that stood up against this cultural white supremacy. Very few. Like maybe I can name it on my fingers 10, since 1958, because they would lose elections. And they can't speak against, like, the bro code. You don't speak against the racists in your party or whatever. And now people are talking about, you said in the beginning, since 2016 and 2020. I mean, Lindsey Graham said that in 2012. However, 2016, 2020, they're just saying out loud what they've always done. This is not new. It has a long history before 1958, but I just wanted to start there because that's where I started my dissertation.
Yeah, help me here. I always thought that in the marriage between the religious right, when they started to coalesce and gain prominence, but also they became strategic, where it's not merely white evangelicals, but it was white religious conservatives coming together to fight against things like segregation in schools. In private universities, and that this taste of power there was really the start of the us versus them, or to solidify white identity without naming it as such, into what you named, like in the 80s when the religious right became more substantive. But is it accurate for me to note the emergence of the religious right around that time in the 58 civil rights, around that time period?
Yeah, I mean, Jerry Falwell and Paul Weyrich was the guy that said he didn't want everyone to vote. It came back to me. Paul Weyrich,
Okay.
who mentored Jerry Falwell,
Okay.
who mentored Newt Gingrich. These connections are crazy. They're all connected. Prior to 1964, Jerry Falwell, in 1964, when Martin Luther King Jr. and others were marching and the Civil Rights Act was passed, there's actually a sermon he gave called Minister in Marches at his church in Liberty. I forget what the church was called, but he founded Liberty University. Thomas Road Baptist Church is what it's called. And he said he didn't think that Christians should be involved in politics because, you should be about spreading the gospel and not about politics. But then when he met Paul Weyrich, who co-founded the Moral Majority with him and who mentored him, Jerry Falwell backpedaled and said, no, it's now the Bible and the ballot, Christianity and the ballot. So really it started emerging. You're right. A lot of Christians after the Civil Rights Act in the 1960s, 1964, and the Voting Rights Act in 1965. And when the U.S. started to desegregate, they said, no, we want to keep our kids. And they started all these Christian schools, which were, white for white kids. And so it started to gain momentum then, but it really broke out. So people say it actually wasn't. There's a historian called Randall Balmer. He says, it wasn't Roe versus Wade that united the right. It was Brown versus Board of Education in 1954 because they didn't want to integrate. And I think he's right. So anyway, so it did start earlier but it really, with Ronald Reagan and the Moral Majority, that was their wedding in 1980. That's when it really gained a lot of power because Falwell backpedaled and now he started, focus on the family. All these other people started coming together to join forces to combat the moral evils. But I don't know if it was just moral evils because it seemed like they liked the power too.
Power. Yeah. Using those dates and time frames coincides very conveniently with the emergence of the megachurch movement. The megachurch movement starts unraveling maybe a decade, not unraveling, but emerging like a decade after that. And so I'm really curious now about the connection points.
Oh, I think they're probably all connected.
Yeah.
They're probably all connected. There's always things that are connected. I haven't studied that in particular, but I'm sure they're connected in some way.
Yeah. They must be. Weird, not weird, on purpose. Behind the scenes, how crafty and how intentional and strategic power holding is in the preservation of white supremacy. Yet, oftentimes you can't just come out with your overt racism. Now, there are moments where you can. There's tests into the mainstream culture of, can I say this? But as we move towards the contemporary, there are these, as I noted, markers of like Charlottesville or George Floyd, and more of the average congregant or the person who grew up, shaped and formed in evangelicalism. That was their crossroads. What was was there an input or some type of culture shift? So maybe Obama opened the floodgates, but where that the formative pieces in white evangelicalism or even white conservative Christianity became okay, not merely marrying politics with religion, which is fine to me, but that's a different conversation. Where it produced a sense of white entitlement that you could now go public with. That public piece of wear my white nationalism or Christian nationalism on my sleeve, and it became okay. Like that just doesn't happen overnight, as we've seen how it's connected. But where does, to put it this way, it'll be a good take here. Where does the audacity come from that now you're okay with wearing the robes out in public?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's one I've thought about. I think if you listen to the rhetoric that these pastors and politicians, that if you listen to what they're saying, and I think the media had a lot to do with this. Okay, I'm going to back up for a second. There's always a backlash. In the summer of 2020, I knew it was coming just from studying history or maybe, just observing. I know they're going to push back after this summer of George Floyd, all the protests, they're going to start. And I'm like, wouldn't you know, in just a few seconds, it started turning around, he did drugs or whatever. And then we're seeing currently from, I think 2016. So, there was a backlash against Obama. That was the 2016 election with Trump. The backlash to Trump with the George Floyd protest. I'm not trying to oversimplify it, but it just I think the Hegelian dialectics is back and forth, backlash. And now after George Floyd, then the Trump administration and just other people that are white supremacists started having their backlash, and they started talking about critical race theory, trying to fire up the electorate in the schools, which is where my dissertation is concentrated. But I think from what I've read, the school board meetings that I've watched, the news that I've watched, and tracing the history, is that there's this sense, part of it's political, part of it's maybe suppressed white supremacy, right? A lot of there's no one explanation, I don't think, like one that takes it all, but except the word that I would use is they're scared they're going to lose their culture and scared they're going to lose their power, because in the United States, that by 2050, white people are supposed to be the majority minority. And this has been going on. They've been talking about this for years, but now it's like, no, this is desperate now. Like, this is our Custer's last stand. He's going to try, and wipe away the Native Americans. And he and his men were killed. That's how I think they're like, we have to hang on to our way of life. Our way of life is whatever their way of life is. Some of the things that people said where, it has to do with gender, like, men are a certain way, women are a certain way, and there's just men and binaries. There's nothing else. That's one thing, gender, right?
Yeah. A white supremacist view of that.
Yeah, women are starting to get uppity, women, so they need to get back in their place. So there's a lot of talk now about, I've heard these political, Charlie Kirk, who's founded Turning Point USA. Anyways, he's told his women that were at his conference, I think January, February this year. He said, yes, you have a college education, but you need to go stay home and have children. And when I hear that, I'm like, oh, that's the white replacement theory. He's thinking that all the Latinos, the Mexicans, not only them, but Muslims and other people, black and brown people are having more children than the white people. So now they're starting to say, you need, the most patriotic thing you could do is go home and have children, have a big family. And that's out loud. I mean, I have the clip.
Lots of people say that.
I can send it to you. And that's all mirroring, it's all mirroring one another. So that's on like the political thing, but he speaks at a lot of religious rallies for guys and stuff. So I'm hearing this kind of notion of manhood, women stay home now. Right. Let's reclaim our manhood, which there's always been that, but it's coming up to the surface in conjunction with the white supremacy. They're all related. The politics, the notions of manhood and gender and white supremacy are all interconnected. And I did not know that until I was in my PhD program. But I actually think, and this is my theory, maybe not the only one that thinks this, but I think it's not so much necessarily, like, I don't think people on the ground, like, I don't say the average American or the average white American, most of them don't know that these are racial dog whistles. I actually think the leaders know. The leaders know, and some of these pastors know. And that's where I hold most of the blame, not all of it, but they know.
Yeah.
I don't know if the average person, they don't know because either you haven't studied the history, they don't know this, or they haven't experienced it. I'm not saying there's no blame, but I have a much higher lack of patience for certain political and religious leaders because they know what they're doing. They know what they're doing. They have their institutions. They have their political parties and action committees, and they all know and now they're starting to focus on K-12 education in
Yep.
the universities. And it's
Yeah.
all strategic. I'm not saying it's a conspiracy. They all talk about it. It's not a conspiracy. They talk about it. So
they're telling you what they're going to do. Believe them.
Yeah. And I think it's because they're worried that they're going to lose their way of life. And that encapsulates. Now, some people say because they just want to be white supremacists, but there'll be some people that are like, no, I have Black friends or friends of color. Friend. Yeah. Or I love, and I think, in their minds, they're like, no, that's not it. And I don't think they're lying. I don't think they just understand how easily the levers are being pulled and how their appeals to the fear, racial fear, financial fear, economic fear, like these Black and brown people, they're going to take over
our jobs.
Our jobs.
They're taking up all the houses. Send them back home.
That was the same fear that white plantation owners had if they wanted to set the Africans free from slavery. They were scared they were going to revolt and take over, like what happened in Haiti, the revolution. They're like, we can't have them armed. We have to watch them because, of course, if we set them free, they'll come and take vengeance on us. That was Southern plantation owners. Now there's this sort of thought and discourse that I've heard a few places here and there, people saying, they're just going to do to us what we've done to them. Or they don't have trust that people of color won't treat them any differently because they're going to say, we've done all these things and they're going to make us suffer. They're going to oppress us. And you hear people saying we're being oppressed. So yes. You hear that.
Like I always would have spoken to the intersection of power preservation or to protect the white male gaze or just whiteness in general, that the moves here are power, they're calculated, they're strategic.
Yes.
But I did not look through the data as you have to land on the side to say that actually this power preservation is rooted in a fear of losing a way of life.
That is my thought.
Yeah, and I echo that, but you're saying that because you went through the meeting notes and you have looked at some of the data, right? That is what it's leading you to conclude.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah. The race, the losing jobs, the different views about because this is where the gender comes in, right? Like people are like, no transgender bathrooms. Like, if people have Christian or different views on that, but listen, we live in a pluralistic society. My hope would be the United States that you would just respect other people, even if you don't agree with them, right? But people fear that their kids are going to be indoctrinated into different gender politics and ways of thinking than they are. So that's where that's why there's gender and race together, right? Like these people, they're like trying to write, or these people, let's say people like me, I'm trying to tell you American history. American history is just not white history. And they are fighting for a certain narrative of history. And they want people to think that, the U.S., this is where the great, exceptionalism. I mean, it's so tied together, I can't even unravel it. So just think of, we were talking about earlier, like our different family backgrounds and the mixing of how we've been. So it's like gender, race, power, the power dynamic among all those, and religion and politics. It's so mixed in that it's really hard to disentangle them in a short conversation like this, but I'm firmly convinced they're all linked together. And in the end, it's a way of life. I don't want to lose my way of life, my history, what makes me proud to be an American. And
which is really a white American. Yeah.
Right. We're losing all this because these Black and brown people and these other people are causing trouble. Why don't they leave things the way they are?
Thank you very much, Dr. Graves. And thanks, Scott. Thank you, Jesse Peters, on the intro, and also Daniel Wheat with all of the bumper music and this outro. Find them on Spotify or wherever you get your music. Episode 2, we started to connect the dots, setting the scenes, adding context to figure out why evangelicals believe and do the things that they do. If we had to sum it up, we'll just call it power. What white evangelicals will do to retain the last vestiges of power. It doesn't matter who they throw under the bus. Sometimes It's their own. A lot of the times, it's folks already on the margins. Does that sound right? So why aren't more people leaving evangelicalism? We're going to ask the question of how evangelicals wound up believing in the things that they believe. We've connected the dots between power and policy, but now we have to peel back the layers with exposing leaders who are part of that plan, and also, why is everyone a sucker in evangelicalism? Turns out, conspiracy theory has a lot to do with it. And not only conspiracy theory, propaganda. Don't believe me? Episode 3 and 4 coming. Don't miss them.